Hey everyone, welcome into this evening's Fireside Chat. Our topic tonight is going to be, to coincide with the reading, strife that existed of serious labor strikes that occurred in the late 1800s that fit right in the middle of our Gilded Age discussions that we started this week. So we're going to go in succession here, starting with the earliest, which was one of the first mass movements of any labor organization, and that was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Now, keep in mind that in the 1870s, the economy of the United States had really become quite tenuous due to the Panic of 1873 and the mishandling of the economy by the Grant administration. By 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes was in the White House thanks to the Compromise of 1877. Nonetheless, in 1877, this railroad strike occurred, and it involved numerous states. In fact, 5 states wound up being impacted by the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Things all started in West Virginia, and from there they trickled on down to Pennsylvania. Illinois was heavily involved in the Great Railroad Strike as well. Maryland was involved, and as was California, too, in San Francisco. All told, for 45 days, railroad workers protested. They set up barricades. They blocked off railroad tracks all over the United States, and this essentially shut down many of the largest railroad cars and companies throughout the United States, threatening the robber barons' abilities to make money off the railroads. And essentially, the strike wound up being broken up in different areas, not by federal troops, but by state militias or in some cases state National Guardsmen. Now, the figures of people being killed are somewhat disputed. There's newspaper evidence in Pittsburgh, for example, that 40 people died just in Pittsburgh alone as a result of this strike that often turned violent when workers and guardsmen or militia began attacking one another in an attempt to break up the strike. In Maryland, there were numerous dozens of people killed in relationship to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Ultimately, there's a couple of things I want you guys to take away from this example. Number one, who was to blame? Many Americans pointed the finger at German and Irish and European immigrants who, of course, were so heavily involved in the railroad industry. And a great sense of xenophobia, which we've already talked about, that nativism, began to permeate once again and ripple through the United States as a result of the insinuation and the association that foreigners, immigrants, were so heavily tied to these labor unions. But ultimately, in the context of American history, this is one of the first large-scale uprisings, and it is foreshadowed to come for the other incidents that we're going to speak of. And in fact, it is one of the largest labor uprisings in all of this country's history. So always want to draw attention to one of the first because it sets the tone for strife and tension between workers and state governments, and eventually, as we'll hear from later, national government intervention with one of the strikes we talk about. Moving on next, I'm going to jump into 1886, the city of Chicago. And we're in May, so beginning of May. Now, around the world, as you guys know in Euro, the labor movement also picked up a lot of steam and momentum thanks to the attention and the growing popularity of Marxism, and due to the fact the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution, was so impactful in Europe. Now, on May 1st, workers around the world began calling for an International Workers' Day, where they were going to protest for an 8-hour workday. This is something that will come up a lot in the reading. If you're ever stuck on a question, you have to identify, what are the aims of a certain labor union. I don't care what labor union it is almost always take it to the bank, looking for shorter work hours and the same pay. And so around the world, labor union workers, and even if they weren't in labor unions, workers began to rally and call for boycotts all over the globe on May 1st. And this movement for the 8-hour work pay with no pay cut really became taken up here in the United States. In fact, numerous cities held parades and protests and marches, calling for the 8-hour day with the same pay. That's kind of the rallying cry, actually. Well, in Chicago, one of the largest meetings to celebrate this International Workers' Day took place, and hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets of Chicago to honor this call for workers around the world uniting in protest of rights, workers' rights. Well, on May 4th, so a few days after the parades had been going on, and I shouldn't really say parade, I should say protests or marches. Somebody, and this is still to this day a mystery as to whom set this off, but a bomb went off during one of the protest marches. A bomb goes off in an area that was known as Haymarket Square. So it's an area of downtown Chicago. The bomb ended up killing 7 police officers and 4 civilians. So 11 people total were killed in the Haymarket bombing. And the bombing then, of course, set off mass pandemonium. And so a riot broke out between workers and police forces that were there in Chicago to quell the protests, marches. And this just turned into a delirious state. And the Haymarket bombing, the effects of it go on beyond just the bombing, because shortly after the bombing, there was this mass panic within the city of Chicago. People believed that the labor unions were trying to take over the city. And so anti-labor union, anti-worker people felt as if there was an anarchist movement deeply entrenched in the city of Chicago. And so there was a quick call for prosecution, and somebody had to take the fall because there was no concrete evidence that existed as to whom set off this bomb and sparked this unrest. So the Chicago Police Department and the district attorney go on somewhat of a witch hunt, and within days, 8 members of labor unions within Chicago, 8 labor union members, affiliations not necessarily affiliated together, 8 were arrested. 1 would be given a 15-year sentencing for his involvement, and 7 would be put to death. Excuse me. So 7 people were publicly executed, given death sentences for their involvement in the Haymarket bombing. Modern historians now support the idea that none of the 7 had anything to do whatsoever with the bombing, and yet they were quickly targeted, quickly fingered for having their involvement. This, in a lot of ways, is a common theme that you'll be reading about and we'll be talking about. The anti-labor union sentiment within the United States drove people during this time period and future time periods to have a great fear of unionists, for subverting government actions, for being associated with communism, for being associated with immigrants and foreigners. And the Haymarket situation is really a chilling reminder of just how, when the law comes together against a certain group of people, treacherous things can happen. And this is not to be slanted in any way, but it is widely believed that these 7 individuals that were killed due to their involvement in the Haymarket really had very little to do. They were targeted because they were in labor unions. That was their crime. But what are you going to do? That's the situation, and that becomes a very common theme in American history moving forward. This sort of negativity and this sort of internal conflict that emerges in the United States with labor unions. The third example is another strike that turned bloody. This one took place in Pennsylvania at a Carnegie steel plant. Now, Carnegie, we talked about yesterday, one of the robber barons, tycoons, monopolies with U.S. Steel. It's one of the largest companies in all of the world. And at a Carnegie steel plant, workers were rallying calling for shorter work hours, so 8-hour workday, same pay. And eventually, a strike took place in 1892. The strike took place at one of Carnegie's plants that was in Homestead. So this is known as the Homestead Strike. So for days, steel workers at a Carnegie plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, went on strike, refusing to work. One of the other things they were arguing along with the 8-hour workday was the end to yellow dog contracts I'm not sure if you guys know that term, what a yellow dog contract is. But as when a worker is hired, they sign a contract that states they will not join a union. So many workers were fed up with these yellow dog contracts being forced upon them. So shorter work hours, yellow dog contracts, that's the circumstances, and just general unrest that was emerging in the Homestead plant. Well, the strategy to break up this Homestead plant was not to call in National Guardsmen or militia, but in fact, these people were actually quite common in the Gilded Age, and they were specific law enforcement, not police officers, but law enforcement agents known as Pinkertons. And a Pinkerton is someone who was actually his job, because no females really worked as Pinkertons. The job of a Pinkerton was to break up strikes. They were strike busters. And by the way, Pinkertons, a couple years ago, I'll just tell you a quick story. Tanner Beiser, who is now graduated and moved on to the Rochester Institute of Technology, Tanner was obsessed with Pinkertons. They were one of his favorite topics in U.S. history. He did like a side project on it or something, and any way he could weave Pinkertons into the conversation, he managed to. So next time you talk to Tanner or you see Tanner, remind him about his infamy with Pinkertons. Anyways, these Pinkertons were called in to break up the strike in Homestead, and a violent reaction occurred. And between workers and Pinkertons, 12 people were killed in this Homestead strike before workers finally went back to work. So yet again, much like Haymarket and the Great Railroad Strike, protests, strikes turn bloody. We'll continue with unions. It's a critical topic at this juncture in U.S. history because it does carry forward into other time periods as well. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and good luck with that reading tonight. I'll see you guys back in class tomorrow. Homer, you want to say goodbye? Homer, say goodbye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.